Hey guys, welcome to our third video, and again we're gonna do this just a couple more times, a quick materials check. Are you in a quiet place? Do you have your headphones on to block out all that outside noise? You have your notebook and a pen or pencil to take some really good notes with me today. You don't need a calculator for this one, so make sure you're just ready to watch. Pause every chance you can. Alright, so again, we're still working on standard functions operation, and the video reference number is 1.1.3. That is Unit 1. This is Standard 1 and Video 3. And what we're going to be talking about today are some properties of real numbers. In our first video, we actually talked about what real numbers were and all the different types of them. And we're going to be talking today about what we can do with those. And there's a few properties that we're going to be addressing. So go ahead and pause if you need to finish writing that down, and then join me when you're ready. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the commutative and the associative properties. And there are really four of these, but we're going to group them together. We're going to be grouping the commutative property of addition and the commutative property of multiplication first. And then we're going to be talking about the associative property of addition and the associative property of multiplication. So this is going to be the commutative property. And we're going to be talking about addition and multiplication. So commutative, if you think of the root word of commutative, it means to commute, to move. And that's what we're going to be talking about, to move around. So talking about the commutative property of addition, what we're really addressing is whether or not we can move numbers around. So for example, if I have A plus B with real numbers, is that the same as B plus A? And the answer is of course. If I add two numbers together, it doesn't matter what order we're adding them in. Let me go ahead and address this with some actual numbers. If I can take 3 plus 4, I will have the same result as 4 plus 3. This is the commutative property of addition. Does it work with negative numbers? Of course it does, because negative numbers are real numbers. Let's take a look. If I have negative 2 plus 5, that is the same as 5 plus negative 2. So what about the commutative property of multiplication? Of course it works. Let's take a look. 3 times 4 is the same as 4 times 3. Now, it does work with negative numbers. Does it work with fractions? Yes, of course it does. Let's take a look at that. So I can have 2 times 1/3, and that will be the same as 1/3 times 2. So this is our commutative property of addition and the commutative property of multiplication. What about the associative property of addition and the associative property of multiplication? Let's give some examples of those. Now, the associative property means that numbers are associating with each other. And when you associate, you group together. You talk to each other. So that's what we're going to be kind of thinking of this one, is a way to group numbers together. So I'm going to give you an example here using addition. I have A plus B, which are being grouped together, and then plus C. Is that the same if I group them different? Now keep in mind, I'm grouping them. I'm not putting them in a different order, because that would be the commutative property. So here I'm looking at, what if I have A plus B plus C? Do I get the same result? Well, let's put some numbers in and take a look. If I have 3 plus 4 plus 5, do I get the same as 3 plus 4 plus 5? Do some quick addition there. That's 7 plus 5, which is 12, or 3 plus 9, which is 12. So this is the associative property of addition. Does that work similarly with multiplication? Yes, it does. Let's take a look. If I have A times B times C is that the same as A times B times C? Keep in mind, I'm not putting these in a different order. I'm just grouping them using parentheses. I'm associating them differently. And yes, of course it works. Let's try 3 times 4 times 5. Is that the same as 3 times 4 times 5? Yes, it is. This would be 12 times 5, which is 60, equals 3 times 20, which is also 60. So that is the associative property of addition and of multiplication. Next property is identity properties, and the identity property also works with using addition and multiplication, and these are really our two main operations that we're going to be working with. So here we go, identity property of addition. Well, identity means that it keeps itself the same. It keeps its identity. It is still itself. So for example, A plus 0 still equals A. Throw a number in. 5 plus 0 still equals 5. So the identity stays the same because we added 0. We did not change its identity. How about with multiplication? What can we do? What can we multiply a number by so that it maintains its identity? Think about that for a second. Maybe you came up with this. I can take a number and multiply it by 1 for it to keep its identity. Any number you can think of, 7 times 1 will still equal 7. It maintains its identity. Those are the identity properties. Next one are called the inverse properties, and once again we have an addition and a multiplication example. The first one's called our additive inverse. The additive inverse. Our additive inverse says, what can I add that's an inverse that gives me, actually it gives me what we used in our identity. So in this case it's the opposite. So it's A plus negative A will give me 0. Think of any example. 5 plus its opposite will give me 0. Negative 2 plus its opposite will give me 0. So the additive inverse is actually the opposite. Go ahead and write that down. The multiplicative inverse what might that be? Well, what is going to give us a 1? So if I multiply any number times what? How do I get it to equal 1? It's the reciprocal. So it's 1 over the number. So if I multiply any number, let's say 4, times its reciprocal, we get 1. This reciprocal is called the multiplicative inverse. It also works the other way. I could start with a half, multiply it by its reciprocal, and it equals 1. That's the inverse properties of addition and multiplication. Our last property is the distributive property. The distributive property is a multiplication property. It is multiplication over addition and subtraction. Let's write that down. This is multiplication over, I'm sorry about that, over addition or subtraction. So, for example, I can have 3 times 5 plus 2. Now, using the order of operations, we would probably want to make that 7 and then just do 3 times 7. But let's use the distributive properties because eventually we're not going to be having just numbers. We're going to be using some variables. So let's take a look. If I have 5 5 plus 2 in my quantity, and I want to distribute a 3. I'm using multiplication over addition or subtraction. That means 3 times 5 plus 3 times 2. Now I can simplify that using multiplication, and I get 20. Let's try that again. And I get 15 plus 6, which is 21. Let's try again. How about a negative 2 times a 6 minus 4? Again, I know we could go ahead and simplify within the parentheses using the order of operations, but let's practice the distributive property. That means negative 2 times 6 minus negative 2 times 4. Let's take a look at what that does. That gives me negative 12 minus a negative 8, and we know we can go ahead and make that a plus 8 if you'd like. And we get negative 4 as our result. And that is our distributive property. Go back and make sure that you've got notes thoroughly on all of the the properties that we've worked on, including the associative property, the commutative property, the identity properties, the inverse properties, and our distributive properties. Make any comments or ask any questions that you need to on the Schoology discussion board, and make sure you try the entrance slip.